Hello and welcome to 3030 STEM. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining and welcome again. And today we are going to do something very, very interesting. We have an interesting talk, an interesting presentation lined up for you. So do stay on and look at why and how and when of science, and in science particularly, three things that are most important for us. We are going to talk about it: food, clothing, and shelter. And it's an interesting thing. A lot of times, we celebrate this day called the Science Day in India on February 28th. And we celebrate it because a very small discovery that was made on 28th February 1928 by Sir Venkatraman led to a winning of a Nobel Prize 2 years later. And that is why this Science Day is celebrated in India. In fact, it's the only Nobel Prize, first and only Nobel Prize that any Indian has won for science. And we will see today such a small discovery of scattering of light, which is what Sir Raman did, how it led to so many interesting things. And we are going to look at science very critically today with three legs: science with respect to food, science with respect to clothing, and science with respect to shelter. But fundamentally, we are going to look at what is science all about. Why should we even study science? I mean, it is an interesting question. Why should I care to study science? In fact, that brings me to the first question on your screen that is right here. And let me take you there. This is the first question. In fact, imagine on a science day or today, we go and send a big order comes out from the government saying science has been banned. And that is the question for you. Imagine, as a gift on National Science Day, science is removed from the school curriculum. What will you think? What will be your reaction? Great, one less exam for the students. Very bad. The jobs of science teachers will be gone. If you are a science teacher, that would be something that you would worry about. Great. Science is a difficult topic, a difficult subject. So now everyone gets great mark and India will become great. Wonderful. So imagine everybody gets 100 in science and we will become good without understanding whatever going on. Oh, very bad. As parents, we cannot push our children in science. Ab Sharma ji ka bachcha aage kya padega? Parents cannot say, oh, this somebody else is, the neighbor's son is better than you. And so, no, of course, these are all questions just in a jest. But the fundamental question that we want to ask, and fundamental question that I think should be asked in every school, in every classroom, by every teacher, by our parents: what is science and why should we study science? In fact, that is the most important question. What is science really all about? In fact, sometimes I feel we have put science on a pedestal. We have said everything, science is truth. Well, sometimes it is not. And we will see today, science, in fact, that is the most beautiful thing about science, is that it keeps on evolving. What is true today and tomorrow? Science is open to critique. Science is open to experiments which prove it wrong. A long time ago, I think about 30 years ago, there was this suggested therapy for women when they reach menopause, that one should take this hormones called estrogen, because the body stops producing estrogen, and it was thought that this could lead to arthritis and weakened bones and things like that. So one can take this therapy and get yourself fixed. But it turns out 20 years later that the same therapy led to a lot of cancer in women. And so things have to change. So science is basically a study that helps us visualize what is going on around us. Science is a technique by which we can understand the world around us, understand what is going around us, and that makes sense of it. And in fact, science can just provide us tools, but how we have to use those tools is something that we will have to think about ourselves. In fact, that reminds me of a wonderful story by this guy, by this person called Richard Feynman. And in fact, he also very amazing physicist. In fact, even more amazing speaker. And he was a wonderful, remarkable speaker. Taught at Cornell and then spent most of his time at Caltech. And he won the Nobel Prize. And he was also involved in the first atomic bomb, creation of the first atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project. And later on in his life, he actually claimed that he felt really sorry he was young at that time, 28-year-old, did not know anything good or bad. He just thought this is a cool project or whatever to work on, and so he enrolled. And his work, of course, was instrumental in creating this first atomic bomb. And he later publicly claimed that he felt bad, and he felt that it was not right for him to for him to have participated in that project, for whatever reason. So science came up with this tool by which we can figure out a lot of energy that is hiding in this nuclear fission, right? When uranium breaks up into two molecules, it releases a lot of energy. That mass gets converted to energy using Einstein's equation. But what we use that energy for is something that and so coming back, something that we'll have to think and decide. And this is an interesting story that Feynman talks about. And this is something that he heard from a Buddhist monk. And the story goes like this, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but I think I really like this story. And the monk says, every time a human being is born, they are given this wonderful key. And let me take you to your screens to show you this picture. There you go. This is Feynman's key. So every time one is born, this is one you see right here is Mr. Richard Feynman. Feynman is right here. Feynman is right here on top of your picture, and these are two doors. So the story goes like this. The Buddhist monk says, every time you're born, you have this key. And with this key, you can open the door to happiness or to sorrow or to misery. But you don't know what that door is. And I think something similar happens with science. Science is that key which can open the door to happiness, comfort, and all of that. And also, of course, our destruction and misery and sorrow. But the most interesting thing is that the science doesn't tell you which is the door, which one is the door, and which is the door to happiness and which is the door to misery. And that is the most interesting thing. We don't know. But we cannot throw this key away. So this key, that science is basically a key, and the key will never tell us which is the door to happiness and which is the door to destruction and misery. And it is for us humans to figure out what is that door. We cannot just throw science away, because science will just provide us with a tool. How and for whom we will use this tool is something that we will have to decide as humanity. And that is the most important thing. Science ye kiske liye hai? What is this science for? And for whom? And how should we use it? We will have to figure out. We will have to make sure we use it for the right purpose. We will have to make sure that we channel the knowledge that science creates in the right direction. And that is what we are going to talk about. And in fact, that's where I think I really like this quote. Let me show you this. Which when I was working in Pune in lab with Arvind Gupta, there was this beautiful quote that was sitting right on the screen, and let me show you that quote. And this is a beautiful quote that I saw on the screen. And somewhere there are engineers helping others fly faster than sound, but where are the engineers helping those who must live on the ground? And this is absolutely an inspiring quote. Imagine scientists, we will have to always worry about who is it that we are working for. And there are a lot of, in fact, sometimes I feel that, I wish that science can focus on problems that are faced by a large section of humanity. Large section of humanity. TB, for instance. There is this disease, and some people call it the poor man's disease because it happens largely in poor countries or economically backward countries. And it's been there for a while. I wonder, why is it that we have not yet come up with a vaccine for TB, whereas we have had vaccines for so many diseases and helped so many people? Why? It's a serious and important question. Sometimes we, as human beings, as scientists, and people, and just people of the society, we will have to think and wonder about all of these things. So that, I think, is the goal of the talk today. And we are going to look at who science, why science, and who is it for, and especially with respect to these three legs, the most important things for us to survive: food, clothing, and shelter. And welcome to 3030 STEM. This is where my name is Professor Manish Jain, and I'm speaking from IIT Gandhinagar. You see IIT Gandhinagar right in your screen, and this is what our lab is. This is where in the screen you can actually see IIT Gandhinagar, in one of these buildings. And this is what our lab looks like. You can see a lot of toys, and of course this is another section of our lab where we have teachers workshops that we do with teachers, and the goal of the work that we do is to bring back that gleam in the eyes of our children, as you see right there. This is a picture we clicked I think about 6 years ago in one of the workshops that I was doing with children in Assam, in northeastern part of India. And this is an absolutely wonderful picture. You see the kind of gleam in the eyes of our children when they look at this toy where a pen is actually hanging or standing in the air without any support. This kind of scientific curiosity that that comes to our children, and you can see that, and that is so palpable. That it can bring back that inherent curiosity, and the goal of this program, this talk, is also to nurture that inherent curiosity in our children. So thank you so much for joining, and we are going to talk about science, what and for whom, today in this episode. And this is the discovery that led to celebrating of National Science Day. Very simple discovery in 1928 by Sir C.V. Venkatraman, where he figured out that if you shine a light on certain molecules, most of the light goes away, but some of the light actually changes its wavelength, and that most of the light will go away as green, but some of it will become red. I mean, these are just colors for illustration, but basically the wavelength of the light actually changes. The scattered light has larger wavelength, or in other words, lower frequency. And this phenomena, it's a very small discovery by Sir Venkatraman, which 2 years later led to the winning of the Nobel Prize. But you can see all of these absolutely amazing things which were used, which were created because of this effect. Things in cell monitoring, tissue diagnostics, microbiology, and absolutely amazing things to figure out the malignant transformation, extracellular matrix, differentiation, endoscopy, and so on and so forth. So just a simple thing about a light being scattered, most of the light, some of the light being scattered and change its waveform, and that wavelength, and that led to a discovery of such amazing and interesting technologies. And that is what science enables us. Some basic thing which can lead to a lot of amazing things. And in fact, a very interesting thing happened in our lab today. What is the purpose of science? That was the question we were asking. And in our lab, it turned out something very interesting. We had a discussion in our lab. Some very, very interesting results came out. The first thing that came out was, and most of us were sort of feeling the same, that science, what is the use of science? Kya zarurat hai science ki? Should we just throw it away? Maybe science is a difficult topic, we should wipe it away, we should throw it away from the curriculum so that everybody is happy, nobody has to study science. But the point is, regardless of whether you study science or not, whether it is in the curriculum or not, science will happen on its own. Things will happen, things will not stop. Science is there all around us in things that are happening around us. Whether we choose to look at them, whether we choose to look at, observe them, whether we choose to look at them and not figure out what is going on, it is our call. Taking science out of the curriculum will not make the science stop. It is just that our progress, our visualization, our understanding, and our progress will stop. Science will happen on its own. And in fact, that is the question that we asked. What is the purpose of science? Why should we study science, and what has science given us? And in fact, when we asked this question to a lot of people in our lab, all our lab mates, the most common answer that we got was that science is basically to make our lives convenient. We didn't used to have water. I remember, I remember in the younger days when we used to go to in the summer vacation to our grandparents' house. 18 people would take a bath in a couple of buckets of water, 2-3. Not because we were unclean, but because we have to, draw the water from a hand pump, bring that inside, and we will take a bath. And we were absolutely clean. But just 2 to 3 buckets, and all the kids. I think not 18, I'm mistaken. I think 9 kids. We were 9 of our cousins. We would all take bath in the same in 2-3 buckets of water, because we wanted to save and conserve. And now imagine the same thing. Because of technology, we have 24 hours running water, and each of us needs about 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 10 buckets of water. It has not made us any more cleaner or more hygienic. It has just led us made our lives so convenient that we don't think about an iota about wasting. And same we can see in lots. I mean, if we later in the talk we will look at the amount of food wastage that we do, amount of water wastage that we do, amount of things that we do. It is only largely because lives have become so convenient that we just don't care about it, don't care two hoots about it. And that is where we will have to and another example. So science has made it so convenient. If I have to go to my lab today, which is about 2 kilometers, oftentimes, I mean, I don't have a scooter, but but we would just choose to have drive take a two-wheeler and drive to the lab. It is just 1 kilometer or maybe 1.5 kilometers, and it might as well be better for my health, for my body, everything, to walk to the lab. But we don't, because it is so convenient. It is made so convenient that we forget that walking and some bit of exercise in the disguise of walking or under the pretext of walking to the lab is so much more inherently good for us, and we forget about it. And so science, in that sense, I will say science has it's a double-edged sword. It makes our lives convenient, but a lot of times it has given us these tools which are for instance, the same thing I can say about the atomic bomb, right? I mean, there was a nuclear. It is absolutely an important discovery that we made, that we can convert matter to energy. But what do we use it for? Have we used it, all of this, in the right direction? Is something that we will have to think, talk, and worry about. Whether it is green revolution, whether it is genetic technology. I mean, right now we have this absolutely incredible tool in our hands that can wreak havoc. And in fact, some people believe that this pandemic actually that we are facing is a result of that. We are doing a lot of these genetic manipulations on organisms, and and if we are not careful, this could be just, it's a huge danger for the whole of economy, for the whole of humanity. This gene editing technique, and I fear about that. I mean, if we, and this has a lot of social implications. Imagine this technology called the CRISPR. And this technology is very, I mean, I will not, I don't remember the full acronyms. It is whatever it is, but this technology lets us chop our genes in the right place and insert the genes in the right place, so that we can change the whole the organism. In some sense, we can create the whole organism ourselves. In fact, I forget the name, but in the lab, there is a lab in San Diego which have actually created the first organism whose parents is a computer. So they have created a bacteria. The code for that genes they have created in the created that code, the whole genetic code, in a computer. Brought 4 chemicals, A, D, C, G, added in all the 4 chemicals which make the genetic material, and then used chemical synthesis to create the whole genetic DNA, and that inserted the DNA in a dead bacteria to create a live bacteria. Imagine, we have this power to create. Now, what do we use it for? I fear about it. I fear whether we give this technology in hands of common people, what will we do? I mean, take us for an example, right? There is this huge bias in our society for for fairer people. And why just our society? We want all the kids who are born to be tall, to be fair, to have long hair, to have no hair. Like, I mean, everybody should have hair. They should be tall. They have all muscles. Everybody is like fast runners, huge muscle. Everybody should be the best possible human being, and we can actually push all our science to go in that direction, to create that genetic material, to change our genes so that everybody becomes the perfect human being. Now, is that a good thing for us as a society? That is the question that we'll have to think and wonder about. Is that good for us? Not to have any genetic variation in our makeup, so that everybody is fair, everybody is tall, everybody is white, everybody is blue-eyed, everybody is whatever beautiful, that concept of whatever we think beautiful is. That just completely makes us, causes us a huge peril as a humanity. We might just be wiped out as humanity if we have no genetic variations, but we will not think about it. So these are the tools that science creates. We will have to be very careful with these tools. We will have to make sure that we keep on working on science, progressing science, coming up with you. But what we use it for, who we use it for, is something that we as humanity need the wisdom to do it. And so I hope, same thing for green revolution, same thing for fertilizers, same thing for pesticides, an insane amount of pesticide, insane amount of fertilizers that we use, which leads to acidification of our soil, and insane amount of pesticide leads to complete destruction of not just microbiome but the whole flora and fauna. The birds are gone, the butterflies are gone, the spiders are gone, the insects are gone, because we think they are just but what about the whole ecosystem that gets damaged just because we want huge more productivity, because we want our lives to be more convenient, because everything should be sitting on a supermarket. We have to really pay huge attention to think about it, and that is what today we're going to do. We had a very long introduction, so now let's come back to talking about why science. Science for who? Under these legs of roti, kapda and makan that we call in Hindi, or food, clothing and shelter, as we think about. So let's just, and before that, let me ask you this question. And so today we are going to do, in context of science, we are going to talk about food. And of course, the green revolution that happened in India because of this hybrid, wheat that we started growing, which led to a huge increase in productivity of our wheat crops. And in fact, most amazingly, this diesel engine that was invented, that came to India in the 1960s, that also coincided with the green revolution. This was the reason, diesel pump was the reason that we could pump out water from underneath the ground and push it and grow a lot of crops. For your regions where we could grow one crops, we started growing two, and in some places three, because we were not just dependent on the rainfall or the canals. We could pump water out from the ground. But the result is as a result, as a result, there are so many places in India where the water table has gone down absolutely way deep. 1,000 feet from 30, 40, 50 feet to 1,000 feet below. I lived in Bangalore for a while, for about 8 to 10 years, and there were places in the apartment complexes where people were digging water 1,000 to 1,200 to 1,600 feet below to dig, to get water out. Now it has happened because we were so sucking the water out from to grow food for our convenience and so on and so forth, that we were not worried about recharging the groundwater table. And of course, that is something that we will have to start look at. We will have to look at all of these technologies with a very critical insight of science and of technology. How we use this science is something that the technology and how science has helped us to make sure that there is food for 7 billion or more than 7 billion of us on the earth. In fact, there was a crisis right when India gained the independence. We did not have enough food. And that brings me to a very interesting story of this person called Fritz Haber. In fact, I can ask you this question, and I can say that, do you know that all of us that are alive here, half of us would not be alive because of this person called Fritz Haber? And the reason for that is this is the person who invented urea. He invented the process called Haber's process, using which we can create nitrogen. Ammonia using nitrogen in the air. And now, as all of you know, nitrogen is a basic ingredient. Ammonia, and using which we can provide this absolutely essential ingredients to the plant, so that there is food productivity. The productivity can go up. We can grow a lot of food because we can trap nitrogen from the air, combine it with hydrogen under high temperature and pressure, and create ammonia, using which we create urea, which we supply to the plants, because of which we can create a lot of food. Our productivity is increased because of urea. But there is this other aspect to urea. Urea is also the reason why 80% of fishes in our ocean have died. 80%. And this huge urea runoff and and of course largely due to phosphorus and nitrogen, leads to eutrophication of our rivers. It is covered by hyacinth, They suck up all the oxygen, and as a result, all the animal diversity or fauna, the fishes are dead. Our rivers are completely devoid of biological organism because of so much urea runoff, and of course also phosphorus, which is interesting. And the biggest reason for pollution or this phosphorus in our rivers and ponds and lakes is soap. Excess amount of soap that we use every single day. Why? Because we want our clothes to be absolutely sparkly, cleaning white and whatever else. बहुत ज्यादा सफेद चाहिए, सुपर क्लीनिंग वाइट, बिकॉज द टीवी कीप्स ऑन सेइंग ऑल द टाइम तेरी साड़ी मेरी साड़ी से सफेद पैसे, रिन की चंकार ज्यादा सफेद. ऑफ कोर्स these two things for those who remember is in Hindi, but all they are saying is that we want the TV is telling us how white it should be. I mean, a little bit of mud is okay, a little bit of brown is okay, but we want it to be absolutely white in color, and we use so much of bleach, so much of soap, intense amount of chemicals in that soap, which basically just go in our rivers, and that leads to eutrophication of the rivers, and the whole, and of course there are no fishes, there is no there is no animals or I mean organism which basically lead to clean. The whole ecosystem is destroyed. Why? Because of this, in some sense, the convenience or the scientific progress or whatever else that you want to call it. So we will have to look at that. We will have to look at how our food is produced, and the insane amount of plastics that we have used. And I'm going to show you this picture. This recent story, and let me show you this picture, and that will sort of clarify what I'm talking about. This is the picture of the largest island in the oceans, plastic islands, and you see in the pictures where they are, right? Huge islands of plastic, almost the size of England. They are floating around in the air, I mean in the ocean, huge amount of plastics, and as a result the sunlight doesn't reach down. I mean, imagine the whole ocean water is covered with plastics. And of course, the plastics will leach in the water, microplastics, all of that stuff happens. In fact, they have, figured out, and let me show you this another picture. And this is the most surprising part. Plastic baby bottles shed millions of microplastics when shaken, or I mean, and you see a lot of this data. And in fact, this problem is happening largely. This problem of microplastics is happening largely in the developed or countries or the rich countries. Why? Because we use these plastics for baby, milk, and in the less developed countries we still use the steel bottles, which are considered poor and backward and all of that. But imagine plastic bottles. They leach plastics and they are going into baby milk and end up in human bodies. In fact, a story recently came up which said that even the breast milk, human breast milk, has lots of plastics and pesticide. It has gone inside. So even the breast milk, which is considered the purest form of food for the beings which are so small, even that is not good food for us to consume, for our infants to consume. That is the state that we are in, and we will have to absolutely look at that. We cannot just be on this path of progress, because otherwise, or whatever we call as progress, because otherwise we need 5 earths. And that leads me to this question: who eats this food? So let me take you. Who eats the largest amount of food? Is it human beings? Is it animals? Or is it plants? And let me take you to this slide, which is sort of communicating all of this. This is of course the reason: plastic inside animals. Impact of green revolution in India. You see how because of green revolution, because of green revolution, because of the water that we pumped out, because of the hybrid variety of feed, we could grow so much feed and feed millions. But this is the reason world with and without synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, you see. And this is an interesting slide and interesting data, that half the world population that I was talking about, half of the world population is supported by synthetic fertilizer, and the other half is supported by without using but that has led to other, urea has led to other issues. And in fact, that reminds me that Haber story I left. Haber was responsible So we, like we saw in that slide, half the world population is supported with the fertilizers and half is without the fertilizer. And of course, he was Fritz Haber got the Nobel Prize in 1937 for coming up with Haber's process. But he also was the one, and this is an interesting story about science, right? I mean, science is not just done by robots or whatever. It is done by human beings, and human beings have a life, and that is why this life about science and scientists is also equally important. Haber did this beautiful thing, wonderful thing, which led to production of so much food, but he was also responsible for working on a poisonous gas, or which was used to kill Jews, which was used to kill Jews in the Second World War. He was working on developing this gas, which was used in World War I, and then kept on doing this research. And his research was used to create poisonous gases, which was used to kill 6 million Jews by the Germans in the Second World War. So the same person, and in fact, it is also, it's a sad story. His wife and son committed suicide when they came to know that he was working on this thing which would lead. In fact, he was himself a Jew, but he wanted to prove to the Germans that he's more of German and he was a more patriot than a Jew, and so he kept on working on research which would kill, which led to this genocide and killing of so many millions of Jews in the Europe. And that's the story of a scientist who created Haber's process, which led to half the population today that can survive because of his invention, but led to destruction of our fisheries in rivers and in oceans, and also worked on this poisonous gas which was used to exterminate or used in genocide in the Second World War, and some of it in the First World War. So that is a story about Haber's process. I thought it is very interesting for us to not just know but think about it. As human beings, this is who we are. This is what we do. We do science, but we are also social beings, and sometimes we don't know what we are doing. We will do something, and and that is where our vivek, our wisdom, has to come in picture, and we will have to pay attention and think about what the consequences of the science that we develop are. Also something that we will have to worry, think, and be responsible for. So talking about food, this is, let me take you and show you this slide. And so sometimes we wonder what happens if we don't use a lot of urea. Will we all die of hunger? Will there be enough food for all of us? And this is an interesting data that I want to show you. And this data says that we produce 500 crore tons of cereal, wheat, vegetables and fruit every year. 300 crore ton of cereals, 50% of which is fed to livestock, which means सबसे ज्यादा अगर आप देखें तो खाना कौन खाता है? इंसान नहीं खाते हैं, जानवर ज्यादा खाना खाते हैं. And let's look at this slide more closely. And so for a 770 crore population, each person could get 640 kgs of food or 390 kgs of cereal per year, which is enough for all of us to survive if we stop feeding and this is the data that you see right here. Cereals, the amount of food that we produce. So of course, if we choose to not, because there is a huge energy loss when we take and we will show this in the next slide. When we feed the same food to animals, they of course they are living beings. They release a lot of energy. They of course release also in their poop they also release this methane, which is also causing global warming. But they use a lot of energy, and we use only some of it. When we eat their flesh, when we eat their meat, the amount of energy loss in that transition from the cereal to animal to meat is about 10 to 100 times. So imagine if we do not feed 50% of our food to animals, and we choose on to become our diet more and more cereals, more vegetarian, more direct cereals, there is no reason for us. We produce enough food for all of us on earth. We will have to make, and of course it might not be easy change for all of us, but definitely the amount of food that we produce today is enough for all of us to survive. Let's look at some more data to convince you of that. And of course, this is the other thing, right? The amount of food that we waste. And you see, in Europe, it is almost 1/4. In North America and Oceania, it is 1/3. The amount of food that is wasted in Europe is 25%. So if that food wastage is gone, if that and 1/3 of the food that is wasted in America, if that food wastage is gone across all the world, we will have enough food, to take care of everything. So 1/3 of the food produced is lost or wasted each year, amounting to 1.3 billion tons. 14% is lost from post harvest, but up to retail level. So imagine 1/3 and 14. अगर इन दोनों को जोड़ दे तो 33 और 14 कितना हो जाएगा? Almost, roughly about 50%. Half the food that is produced is wasted. आधे खाने को तो हम जानवरों को खिला देते. Half of it we feed to the animals, half of it we waste. So if we don't do that, there is enough food. There is enough food for all of us. And some of the things that. So that this is where we'll have to worry about what kind of food. So of course there is a lot of food that we have, but we'll have to also worry about the kind of food that we eat. And this is where this slide comes into picture. This shows the amount of effect that each kind of food that we have on the environment. You see, the topmost, the longer the line, the most amount of impact that it has. And you see beef, and all the animal products are right there on top. And if you compare it with something at the bottom, some of the fruits, citrus fruits, apples, vegetables, rice and cereal, 10 to 100 times less intensive in terms of not just and we'll show you for the same for water, the greenhouse emissions, right? The amount of impact that these food have is 10 times to 100 times more if we consume more animal products. So slowly we'll have to start moving towards slowly or fast, whichever way. Otherwise, the doom is right there, and we'll have to think and worry about it. And you see, all of that is happening because the global meat production has skyrocketed. In 1960s, Asia was consuming in fact, largely in China, very little, you see, very little, and it has gone up. So Asia today consumes almost 40% of the overall meat production. And it has happened in the last 50 years. It doesn't mean that we have suddenly become more healthy. So in fact, obesity has become the largest problem. Heart diseases, cardiac problems have increased. And some people are also leading this to causality of cancers. With large amount of meat consumption, animal food consumption has led to lifestyle diseases, as we call it. And that is something that I'll have to worry about, not just for the environment, but just also for our own health, like this slide is sort of showing. And like they say, the whiter, and of course, the other thing that we'll have to also look at, the kind of cereals that we eat. Oftentimes, like this slide was saying, the whiter your bread, the sooner you are dead. The whiter your bread, the sooner you are dead. And what it is trying to say is that large amount of food that we consume, the cereals that we consume, is polished. And polished, when you say polished wheat or polished rice, most of the interesting ingredients on the top, we whisk it away. We refine it and all of that, and we remove it, and as a result, the fiber, the vitamin is all gone, and all we left is this germ, which is basically pure sugar or pure carbohydrate, which has a lot of high of course gluten, but also very high glycemic index. What that means is the moment you eat the white bread or the refined bread or whatever, immediately it converts to glucose, leads to a lot of diabetic issues. It is much better to eat food which have low glycemic index, which convert to glucose slowly. If that happens, then it leads to, and for that, millets is the answer. And if even within cereals, if you look at rice and wheat and compare that to these hard grains which grow without water, almost without water, these millets, and that is why, but they don't look white. And of course, we are almost infatuated with this color, that we want to eat white bread, we want to eat white chapati, we want to eat white tortilla, as opposed to these black looking grains or brown looking coarse grains which have low glycemic index, more amount of minerals and calciums and vitamins. This slide, if you will see, you can compare. Oh no, not this one. Let me show you. Yeah, here you go. The amount of nutritional content per 100 grams of grain in rice as compared to paddy rice, or compared to wheat. And you see all the millets, or everything else is a millet: foxtail, little, kodo, proso, barnyard, sorghum, pearl white, quinoa, which is not grown too much in India, but all the other ones are grown in India. And you see most of the you see barnyard millet, and most amount of of course, the energy wise they are all same. Energy wise, all the cereals are same, but the amount of protein that you see is much more in the millets, as opposed to the minerals and the calcium and the phosphorus and iron. All of that is much more in millets. So it makes so much more sense for us to start moving towards these coarse grains or millets, because they use less water. Less water you have to pump from the ground, right? They are more healthy. They have low glycemic index, doesn't get converted to sugar, and so you will not have those insulin problems and so on and so forth. So we'll have to start, even within the vegetarian food, even within the cereals, we'll have to look at what is really good for us as a body and what is really good for us, for our environment or for our earth. If we want to sort of live as a humanity for long on this earth, we will have to worry about that. So of course, these are the millets that we will have to sort of look at. Even when we look at these sugar, for instance, these days they are saying the biggest problem the developed world is facing is that of sugar consumption. Huge amount of sugar consumption, and that too white sugar. And look at the consumption. I wanted to show this slide. Compare white sugar, which looks white, compare that to jaggery, not even brown sugar. Jaggery is basically is real brown and sometimes black. And let me show you this slide. Everything is zero in sugar. And compare that to jaggery, right? Protein, 4 times more. Carbohydrate, of course, is the same. Energy is less, which is what we want. Calcium 6 times more, phosphorus 40 times more, total minerals 6 times more. There are vitamins in jaggery, 0 in sugar. So I can also add, the whiter your sugar, the sooner you will be more unhealthy or whatever, right? I mean, so that is what we will have to sort of worry about. I mean, and of course, because we are having this thing on food. Let me also take another example of oil. In the last 20 years, India's consumption of oil has, I think, doubled. We were completely self-reliant in oil food about 2000, and by now we import, I think, about half of our oil is imported, and largely it is this palm oil which comes from Indonesia, and the result of that palm oil is the whole plantations are, the whole rainforests are completely chopped and planted with these very monoculture kind of palm trees, from which we get this cheap oil. Not good for health, but it is extremely cheap. And we are addicted to cheap oil. I mean, not just cheap oil like the gasoline, but even cheap oil, which is food grain. So we have, in India, we have gotten so much addicted to this cheap oil and cheap all these snacks, which all use palm oil. Not good for health, but since they are, and this is where I think convenience comes into play. Imagine, the reason we are consuming so much junk food in India, in our households, is because it is so convenient. It is so convenient to buy a pack of Lay's potato chips or whatever brand that you like, and just pop it. And once you pop, you can't stop because sometimes there are these salt, sugar and fat, extreme amount of salt, sugar and fat. Human beings are wired. We are wired, our brains are wired to all these 3 things. We are addictive, just like we are addicted to nicotine and all of that stuff. They release chemicals in our brain which gives us sense of happiness, and we want to consume more and more. The stomach is telling don't eat more, it is full, but the brain it is getting these endorphins and pleasure sensations, so we want to keep adding. And that's why this junk food, they will make sure in junk food that you add salt, sugar, and fat. In fact, very interestingly, there is also this research that is happening, which is suppressing these emitters, which when you it is called satiation enzyme. When you feel full, there is an enzyme that comes to brain which says, okay, stop. But what happens is that there are these chemicals which will suppress this enzyme, so it doesn't reach the brain. So we don't know whether we are full, and we'll keep eating and eating. So imagine, is this the kind of science that we really want to develop? And even if we do we want to put it in our junk food so that we keep on eating just because we want to, sell junk food? That is something that we'll have to worry about and think about. The kind of food that we are eating, it's just because of convenience. Imagine if the junk food is not available. If you were to make your own potato chips, we will not eat so much, because it takes so much time and effort to chop the potato, to peel it, to fry it, to all of that. And so maybe we'll eat it once and not eat it again. And that, I think, is the reason why the proliferation of junk food has happened, because of it has become so convenient. It is right there on our phone, on our just this click of a button or whatever. So I'm not saying that we don't need these conveniences, but there is another aspect to convenience in terms of our health, in terms of health of our human body, and in terms of the health of the whole environment, earth that we live on. And that, I think, we'll have to really look at in all of these things. So let me see if and of course, and this is the amount of water, in the millet discussion. This is the amount of water that is used by sugarcane, right? For which we really rice and cotton and whatever. And you look at the amount of water that is consumed by millets, which is much less. A slide that you want to look at, the most, and in fact the water consumption has increased from 1900 to 2010 by almost 6 to 7 times. No, much more. From about 400, 10 times. 10 times the amount of water consumption. And most of it, if you see, most of it is used for irrigation, and next highest is used for livestock. Which means सबसे ज़्यादा पानी, the most amount of water, and industry and household are using very little comparatively. So most amount of water is used by agriculture, because we are pumping it out, and we are doing very progressive and very mechanized agriculture, and we are growing things which require a lot of water. And then the next biggest consumer is livestock. The meat that we eat is the biggest consumer of water. And if we were to just convert that into our cereal production and using millets, the amount of water production will become almost half if we go by that data. If we and that is the biggest thing. I mean, imagine if we convert all our livestock to to grow. I mean, it's a hypothetical thing, but livestock and what kind of food that we grow, all of that will lead to consumption of conservation of groundwater that we talk about. And that brings me to, and within the food, we'll have to also look at these days the food that we eat is contaminated with antibiotics. And it's a very interesting phenomenon. I mean, very scary phenomenon at that. The vulture population in India has finished. 99% or some huge 95% of the vultures in India have become extinct. And there was a huge research that happened because of which this came out. And largely, why? What was responsible? This antibiotic, or the medicine called diclofenac. And has happened because of our livestock production. All our livestock, the cattle, and this is Indian story, and I'm sure it has happened in other countries also, but huge problem. And that has led to the corpses, because if there is no vulture, the decomposers are gone, right? Who is going to decompose all the dead animals, and whatever? They were our natural decomposers, and we fed our livestock, our cattle, our cows and buffaloes with so much diclofenac. And that diclofenac was in those animals, and when those animals were eaten by vultures, it led to diclofenac going in the vultures, and their eggs became thinner, and so the chicks would come out early and die. 99 or 95 to 99% of vulture population has. And so now we have banned diclofenac in India, but I don't know how much we are still using or not. But these are the kind of things that we'll have to. Who eats the most medicine? And the answer will be shocking for you. The amount of antibiotics usage. This is the reason why there is antibiotic resistance. Most amount is done by pigs. The antimicrobial consumption, mostly by pigs and chickens and cattle and fish. If you add that, they are eating 3 to 4 times more antibiotics, antimicrobes than human beings. And as a result, this is what is happening. We are having a huge issue with antibiotic resistance, and that is the biggest challenge that we as a humanity we are facing. And the reason for that is tremendous amount of antibiotics we pump in our animals who we eat. So our move to more vegetable diet, more cereal diet will of course take care of a lot of this. And even for those who are eating animals, we'll have to make sure that इतना ज्यादा, और वो इसलिए है क्योंकि बहुत ज्यादा पैदा करना चाहते हैं. We want our animals to grow very fast, very quick, and we will keep them in very unsanitary conditions. As a result, we'll have to make sure that we pump antibiotics, just dump antibiotics in their feed, so that that as a result leads to huge antimicrobial resistance. The data is shocking. 7 lakh people die each year due to drug-resistant diseases, including 2.3 lakh people who die from multi-drug resistance TB. 2.3 lakhs. 7 lakh people die due to drug resistance. In India, 56,000 newborns will die each year due to sepsis caused by organisms that are resistant to antibiotics. Drug resistant diseases could cause 1 crore deaths by 2050. And so that's why we'll have to really look at what is it that we eat. Are we eating just for the taste? Are we eating just for the fashion? Or are we eating just to make sure that our bodies are healthy? And are we eating, we have to be conscious that are we eating so that we stay healthy and our earth also stays healthy. And for that, these are some of very difficult choices. It might seem actually difficult, but these are the choices that we will have to make. The food that we eat and the kind of food that we eat, and its impact on us, on our bodies, on human bodies, and on the overall the earth and the environment. And there is a lot that is dependent upon it. The reason that we will exist as human species on this earth, the biggest thing that might while we are trying to see how we can go to Mars and grow food there because earth is falling short, we will really have to look at the real reason and how we can fix the problem here, than rather trying to escape to Mars and fix the problem over in Mars. I think the problem is right here on the earth, and the solutions are also right here. We will just have to become more aware. And while science can keep on growing, we will have to use our wisdom to look at science of food to make sure that we grow and consume the right kind of food and in the right kind of environment and things like that. So and now let's move on to cloth, right? That is the next thing that we sort of do. Roti, kapda, makan. Food, cloth, and shelter. And so moving on to cloth, and of course we are running out of time, so I'll try to sort of try to wrap this up quickly. But one of the most interesting stories that I thought I'll try to tell you is this, and this happened to me about a while ago. I was in Delhi. I was traveling in metro, and Delhi in the peak summer, it is about 46, 47, 48. And because we have such large concrete, lots of concrete buildings in any developed city, including Delhi, this concrete absorbs all the heat and radiates. So while the temperature might be 45, if you point a thermometer, the infrared thermometer, you will look at the temperature will be about 64, 65. Which is very interesting for me. There are these infrared thermometers. You point on somebody's head and it tells you the temperature. Imagine pointing this thermometer in the peak of the heat in the sky, the temperature will be 0, -1. Because that is how cold the atmosphere is right up there wherever it is pointing, right? Whereas if you point it on any building in the summer or even late in the night, it will be 65. as opposed to the temperature being 35 or 37. So that basically tells how much is the radiation temperature, a thermal body that is radiating at what sigma T to the power minus 4, that is the amount of radiation. And so fourth root of that, and that is what these thermometers calculate. I was so shocked, coming back to the story, I was shocked that in such 47, 48 degree heat in Delhi, people were wearing, a lot of people were wearing these jeans. Jeans as a cloth is very thick and rugged. It is meant for people to be worn when you work in very, like mines or oil industry and things like that, which are very rugged conditions, very dirty, sort of oily sort of conditions, so that it protects your skin. It is a thick cloth, so anything will not. You are saved. Your body is saved. But we are wearing it as a fashion. And that too in temperate, in tropical climates like Delhi and like in India. Most of India is tropical. So this kind of cloth does not make any sense to be worn. It is not healthy for our bodies. The sweat doesn't evaporate, it stays inside. It can lead to whatever and it necessitates that we will feel so more hot that we will need extra cooling, ACs, this and that or whatever. The best cloth to be worn in tropical climates like India is pure cotton, which is breathable, not hard meshed cotton and thick cotton or thick cloth like jeans is. And that is evident, right? We are doing it not because it is best suited for our health, for our conditions, but because that has become a fashion. And in fact, India is now the biggest exporter of denim or what we call as jeans to other countries which are cold and frigid, and maybe it makes sense, but for us, we will have to really think about it. And I wanted to show you how much energy or how much water is consumed by a pair of jeans. And so let me just take you there. You see, one pair of jeans, it takes about 7,600 liters of water to make one pair of jeans. And of course, for those who wear jeans, you might have realized that washing that jeans is also very, very hard and it takes a lot of water. But just to make one pair is 7,600. That is the amount of water we drink. That is the amount of water that a jeans drinks in some sense, right? So the question is, sabse zyada, pani kaun peeta hai? And of course, maybe jeans also drinks a lot of water. That is what we'll have to look at. And the other thing that about the cloth I wanted to talk about was this, the number of things that we want to buy. Right, a regular single T-shirt will also drink about 350 liters of water, right? A regular T-shirt will also drink about 300 to 2,000 liters of water, and we'll have to worry how many T-shirts do we actually need, how much cloth do we actually need. That is also something that we'll have to sort of worry about, because each time we buy something, we are consuming so much more water. And that is what the other thing about the cloth, and this is a very interesting data. The amount of cloth the amount of cloths that are produced every single year, 150 billion garments, 150 crore garments every year that are being made, which is 20 per person. 20 and imagine. Every person is buying on the earth on an average 20 garments per person, and each of that is drinking or at least from anywhere from 5,000 to 75,000 liters of water. That is the amount of water we are consuming for making the garments. Do we need 20 garments every year? Whereas each of the cloth lasts for so long, 20. And in fact, and this is the data when we average across the whole world, but if you look at and 30% of it is just wasted. And this is the data for the whole world, 20 garments per year. But if you look at just America, 70 garments per person in America. 70 garments, 70 kapde har saal, every year. Do we need that many clothes? And 30% of it, the clothes produced never get used. Most of us, it lands in a landfill. Matlab, they get dumped and you see like that, right? 12.8 million tons of clothing sent to landfills every year. And that is the kind of 50% of the fashion produced is disposed under a year. I mean, which is just so amazing. Half of the clothes that we buy are not used. 50% of it is thrown away after whatever you use it is in 1 year. And we'll have to look at the kind of, and now that brings me to the other most interesting thing, which is microfibers. This is the new food phenomena that is happening. I mean, this is the new cloth phenomena that is happening. The cloth that we wear is, lot of the cloth that we produce today is basically made out of microfiber. It is the source of all the cloth is not cotton, it is not wool, it is not natural fibers which can be over time which get degraded and which can, yeah. So most of the cloth that we make today comes out of oil. Imagine oil, out of which we create polyester and polyterylene, polyester and terylene and this and that, or long chain polymers basically which come out of crude oil. And we don't use natural fibers. The only difference is natural fibers are decomposable, right? They decompose and they go back to the ground, and they get digested by microbes and so on and so forth. And but these any natural, non-natural fiber that we make that comes out largely from oil are not decomposable, and so they stay on the earth for thousands of years before they are decomposed and finally brought to earth. So that is leading to a lot of oil pollution, and if I can call that pollution, they all go. And the biggest thing that is happening is something called the microfiber, and this is a very recent phenomena. And let me show you. And this is largely coming out of fleece. And so let me show you this very interesting article that came in the New York Times, very, very celebrated newspaper in the US. And this is an ad by the company that makes these jackets, and they're saying, don't buy this fleece jacket. Why? Because every time you wash a fleece jacket, you release 0.0 to 2 grams of microfiber. And the most dangerous part about this microfiber is that this microfiber cannot be filtered, right? It ends up in it cannot be filtered. When you wash, it goes in the water. It cannot be filtered by the filtration plants, whatever. It ends up in the sea. It ends up in the guts of the fishes. And there was this very interesting study. We will give you a link on the we have given the link on the description. They figured out that some people were doing some research on the fishes that they were catching. They found out that the intestine of the fishes were completely filled with these microfibers, completely chocked and blocked, because this cannot be filled by sewage treatment plants or whatever water treatment plants that we have, and hence it ends up in our rivers, it ends up in our oceans, it ends up in the it ends up in our human bodies, use it through the animals that we eat, and the water that we might drink from our rivers. So it's a very, very huge recent problem coming from the kind of material that we used to make our cloth. And so that we will have to be very careful about the material that we use for our two things. The material that we use to make our cloth, it has is it natural, or is it man-made, or it is synthetic, or it is coming from the oil, and the amount of clothes that we eventually end up buying. And that is also something that we'll have to, and so we will have to look at the kind of material that we use to make cloth, to make our cloth, and the how much amount of cloth that we make, or how much amount of garments do we need every year. That is something we will have. It doesn't come for free. It's huge amount of energy and water that is used to make the cloth. So we'll have to worry about both the material and the content, the amount that of cloth that we consume as a humanity, as overall human beings. So we will have to worry about that. That brings us to the next part, the last part of our story of science: food, cloth, and shelter. And to begin this talk on shelter, to the screen right here, spider web, 1000 megapascals of load. That is what the amount of load that it can bear. Whereas steel is only 750 to 850 megapascal. Bamboo comes very close, 350 megapascals. And when you say mega is 10 to the power of 6, and pascal is the unit of pressure. This is the amount of pressure that can be handled. So imagine now, a simple bamboo is actually half the strength of steel. And there is this very interesting person that I met a long time back. His name is Vaibhav Kale. He's son of this person called Vinu Kale, who was who people used to people call him the bamboo man of India. He made Vinu Kale used to make every single thing from bamboo, including the the suitcases, of course, furniture, houses. Vaibhav's company called the Wonder Grass. I'm not, it's an interesting. You guys should go check this thing called Wonder Grass. It is a grass that grows abundantly in India, and the only thing that we use for bamboo is to chop it, crush it, and make paper out of it. It is the longest man-made, one of the longest man-made fibers, right? And imagine, and such long fibers, it is time that we think about it. Maybe we can make cloth out of it. That is where the science and the research, in my opinion, should also focus on. Longest fiber, strength, half the steel. Why are we not focusing on bamboo as a product to make our houses strong? And of course, Vaibhav is working, and he has designed a lot of houses which are completely made out of bamboo, and we'll have to look at that. Why just concrete and steel? Of course, it's a 100-story building. You need that kind of strength. But if it's a 2-story house, a bamboo does a great job. In fact, in the northeastern part of India, this is what a lot of people use to make their houses, bamboo, because it is abundantly available. It is completely decomposable. After your house breaks down, or if you want to remodel it, you can just throw it in the ground, and pretty much few months later it is gone, because it will be eaten by the microbes and converted to very rich manure and sand and all of that. Soil and all of that. So that is something that we will have to focus on. That is where the science has to also start focusing on, not just something that is convenient. And of course, this can become convenient too. We'll have to look at a lot of replenishable material to do these things. So let me show you a few things. This is the bamboo man of India, Vinu Kale, his son. Wonder Grass makes absolutely amazing houses with Vaibhav Kale makes absolutely amazing houses with bamboo. Bamboo-based system. 45% of world's bamboo forest in India. Are we using it? Largely, we are using it just to make paper for newspaper. More strength to weight ratio than teak wood and even mild steel. Reaches a max height of 6 to 9 months. And in 6 to 9 months, it is ready to be chopped and used, and releases and needs much less water and releases 30% more oxygen. So imagine the benefits, right? And 1 BHK, absolutely amazing. 1 BHK house, 400 square foot of house needs 500 bamboos or half an acre of plantation. Just in half an acre of plantation, in 6 to 9 months, you can make a house. And next year, in the next 6 months, you can make another one. So we will have to start looking at all that, right? And that is what, and of course, many more materials. And at this time, I think it'll be good to show you what we did in our lab in IIT Gandhinagar. Made this beautiful bamboo geodesic, 1,500 3-feet bamboo sticks, 1,500 of those. And the picture you see on the right hand side is the 15-foot geodesic. On the left, it is a 25-feet geodesic that we made with bamboo. Mud vertical. This is absolutely the other thing that we'll have to also look at: bamboo and mud as a material. If we are trying to make a 2-story house, and this is something that I experienced in Himachal myself. Himachal Pradesh is in the northern, next to the Himalayas. Sort of cold. Of course, quite cold. And I noticed the older houses that were there, their walls were about 1.5 feet, 18-inch thick walls. Each of the brick was sun-dried brick right there from the ground where you make the house. You dig out the mud, make these mud bricks, and make these houses. Of course, the walls will be very thick, but they are hugely thermally insulated. The temperature inside the house will always be almost 3 to 4 to 5 degrees higher than what it is outside. So it is cooler in summer, and because mud is a great insulator. It doesn't absorb heat like concrete does or like cement does, and so we will have to look at that. Of course, it is not as convenient, because if we made mud houses, then it has every few months, every few weeks, we will have to sort of the floor at least has to be taken care of by either cow dung wash or mud plaster is what they used to do. And this beautiful and this amazing person who has done a lot of work in this technology, DD Contractor. And she has done a lot of work in that part of Palampur area of Himachal Pradesh. She passed away a few months back. She was in late 80s, and she's been doing that phenomenal work. The kind of buildings that she has made and designed is just phenomenal. Unfortunately, today, if you want to do make a mud house, which looks much more elegant, which is more cost effective, which is absolutely good for the environment because you don't get any foreign material, which is if the house breaks down, it can mud is right away, you can grow your food in that mud. And so everything is very, very good about this material, but the technique to make these houses is gone. It will be very hard to find people who have the expertise or whatever expertise that is required to make those houses. And so that is scarce, and that is somewhere, I mean, that is where I think we will have to start focusing on science that is good for our earth, science that is good for our environment. That is where the focus of science has to be, not just on progress for just for the convenience sake. We will have to look at the kind of impact that our science is having on the environment. And so with that, I will just say thank you so much for watching. And we will, I mean, the whole goal of the episode was to look at science, who the science is for, what the science should focus on, who is it for, and what is it for, and where we should try to focus on that. Science, of course, is the art of understanding the truth that is around us, how things work, but how we use that technique, how we use the tools that science builds for us, is for us to take forth and use our wisdom to use our tools wisely. So thank you very much.